Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to my second half of the faction overviews for Spellweaver. Probably should have done this a couple days ago, but anyway. So, for this video we're going over the Rage, Corruption, and Dominion, also called the Evil factions. And yes, that's a thing. So anyway, let's get on to the collection, and we will start with Rage. So, if you didn't go and watch my other faction overview video, I would suggest you go and do, because I'm not going to really explain how I sort this out. I'm just going to kind of go with it since it's the second video. But basically looking at how they deal with threats, how they provide threats, and how their lands and heroes work with their faction. So, first things first, Rage. Now, Rage deals with two different types of threats when it comes to removal. First things first is creatures. They have all the burn. They have things like Fireball, which is just straight removal, and they have a bit of AoE and things like Fire Blast, again, good at dealing with creatures. The other thing that they're good at dealing with is artifacts. Not spells, not curse spells, they have artifact removal. Detonate is instant, and then, not fear, and then Goblin Fireworker is also instant and is on a creature. Costs a bit more, but it's a 2/2, so the point is, it's a bit like with nature, where they have Test of Time and also the slightly more expensive Unicorn, and in this case it's something similar. And so in terms of threat removal, they can't deal with curses, but they're middle of the road when it comes to threat removal. So, on to threats. Now, Rage have, in terms of creatures, the most early game and most aggressive creatures in the game. More so than even Corruption, which we'll get to in a little bit. So they've got two attack 1-drops. Lizard Barbarian has a drawback because it's a 2/2, but the point is they're both 2 speed and 2 attack 1-drops. In the case of the Goblin Warrior, he's also a Goblin, which doesn't really come up, but is slightly relevant. Apart from that, they have pure aggression, with Swift being one of their mechanics that they use a lot of. A little bit like nature, they have quite a few Swift cards. And in this case, Swift, attack, 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 and you can sacrifice it to deal more damage. Then they have other sorts of swarm effects like Gibbo and Ronnie, where it creates 2 2/1s with 2 speed. As a general point, most red creatures have 2 speed, that's their average, a bit like Wisdom, where the average is 2, and they don't have that many 3 speed creatures, and they don't have that many 1 speed creatures. There's a couple, but not that many, and the 3 speed is usually on the more expensive ones. Besides that, they have some reusable later game threats when it comes to creatures. They are, along with Wisdom, the faction that has the most reusable abilities. So things like Disciple of Zash for mana. Each turn you can ping. Things like their big sort of big turn 7-drop is a Red Dragon, which has a reusable damaging ability, and the Phoenix has energy manipulation when it comes to coming back to life. They're the other color besides blue that has energy manipulation in terms of totems and shamans and things like that. In terms of spells, most of it is removal, and they also have an aggressive side to them. A couple of exceptions, like Fire Blast, can only be removal, but most of their stuff can go to the face. Fireball, and then you've got things like Massive Attack, where it only works when attacking, useless when on the defense, but the point is it gets more and more damage in. Then they've got the big spell Dragon Fire, which is basically a Red Dragon ability all at once. If you notice, Red Dragon's ability is exactly the same as Dragon Fire. A little bit cheaper, but not reusable. So, that's more or less Red's sort of spell and creature thing. There are a couple outlying effects, like there are for all factions, things like Goblin Looter, where if you hit them, you get to draw, because that's how Red works. There's the Shaman cards, which work around totems, and also Burning Rage, where they have a concept of you can ramp, but you have to sacrifice something when you ramp, in this case damage. Now, let's go on to their shrines. Now, they have 2 different shrines as usual. They have Mountain Sanctuary, which is the uncommon shrine, and it lets you look at the top 4, take a totem, put it onto play. This might remind you of the Advanced Order hero, something very, very similar, but totems instead of angels. The other one is Altar of Dragons, which lets you discard any card at random. It's a dragon it puts onto the field, which is incredibly powerful, and otherwise it deals 3 damage to any creature, essentially making a fireball. So in this case, one of them is tribal and the other one is just solid. As far as heroes goes, they have Basic Zash, where the creature targeted can't block every other turn, which helps with aggressive plays, and then they have Zash the Annihilator, which can be played in a control deck because it deals 3 damage to each creature, but because it deals 3 damage to each hero, it's also used in aggro from time to time. So again, the idea of burning your opponent to death applies on both sides of both the controlling and the aggressive side of Rage. So, on to Dominion. Now, Dominion is purple, and it is the more controlling side of black. Now, that's not an entirely accurate description, but if you come from Magic, that will be the most accurate description you can really have as a first impression. So, as far as dealing with threats, they have situational removal, like Assassinate. They have a little bit less situational removal, but it's still vulnerable to removal, because it's an artifact, and Helmet Domination, where you can steal things. And then they have the big sweepers like Cataclysm. While Dominion has arguably the best creature removal in the game, although it's either first or second depending on which way you look at it, they even have their big 8-resource creature has a removal spell inbuilt onto him. They make up for it by being completely worthless against artifacts and spells, permanent spells. They can't remove either of them. The only way they can remove them is preemptive in the case of Mind Extortion, which allows you to take a spell or artifact from anyone's hand. Now, this is situational, but it's the only way they can deal with it. In terms of their own threats, they have a sub-theme of being aggressive with things like Spoiled Aristocrat, which is arguably the best 1-drop in the game. Has a drawback, but if you curve out, it's a 3-attack 1-drop. Then they have things like Gross Experiment, which takes implants from the top of your deck and puts them onto the Gross Experiment and can get out of control very quickly. This is accounted for, and we go over the spells, we go over the implants, they're all quite powerful. In terms of other creatures, they have some utility creatures like Shadowstep Assassin, and as a general, you'll notice that most of their creatures have special abilities and are not particularly solid on their own. A couple of exceptions like Thunderstorm Titan, which is one of the best costed vanilla creatures in the game, being a turn 4 4/4, and is actually quite powerful. So the Thunderstorm Titan is very, very powerful, and is one of their only just sort of beat your face in creatures. Most of their creatures have drawbacks, but are powerful for their mana cost. Like Swiftblade Assassin has this drawback where if he attacks or blocks, you have to pay 1, and the Spoiled Aristocrat can't attack or block until you play another creature. Even things like Gross Experiment kind of has a drawback where it's luck-based, and the implants all put weakness counters on it. So all of their creatures have some sort of either obvious or hidden drawback that makes them weaker. Even some of their big ones, like Blood-Seeking Mutant, if you can't put... basically, at the start of every turn, you put a counter, a weakness counter, on a creature, and put a might counter on the mutant. However, if you can't do this, and it can only do it on non-vampire, so it can't target itself. If you can't do this, it bounces back to your hand, so that's the drawback. In terms of spells, they've got, as I said, board sweepers and removal, but they also have persistent threats like Vampirism, which lets you be quite aggressive and heal, and it's a sub-theme where they have a lot of artifacts and spells, things like Chalice of Yunks. Again, very, very tricky effect if you read that there. If I'm going through some of these cards so quickly because they're just examples, remember you can always just pause the video to read them. And the other sub-theme they have in the spells and artifacts section is implants. So they've got 3 implants. Well, technically 4, but 3 offensive ones. Metabolic Overcharger, +3/+3 and Unstoppable. Paraspike Armor, +1/+1 and Unblockable. And then they have Grappling Hook, +2/+2, and you get to pull things from the front row to the back, from the back row to the front row. But the drawback on all these is at the start of its controller's turn, a weakness emblem is put on the implanted creature. That is a -1/-1 counter as shown here. So all their implants have drawbacks, but they're all very powerful. That's why the Gross Experiment has a drawback, because all of those implants, the weakness counters add up. It's also the weakness of the weakness counters are the weakness of Helmet of Dominion, because eventually the creature will die. So, in terms of shrines, they've got Stronghold Metropolis, which works well with token creatures and also works really, really well with the Helm of Dominion, because you can steal something and sacrifice it. which means they can't get it back, and it just basically is a 4-mana removal spell that draws a card. And then they have Cathedral of the Night, one of the strongest shrines in the game, arguably strongest or second strongest in my opinion, which puts a weakness emblem on a creature and you gain 2 life. So very, very good against aggro. Long cooldown, that's the only balancing effect for this particular shrine. Now, in terms of heroes, they have basic Despina, which has inner power, refill all your mana crystals, looks very, very powerful, but it has a 4-turn cooldown, which is huge. And it also has a big cost, which means if you have 7 mana, you can pay something for 4, refill, and then pay 7, so it's not as much of a ramp as it looks, and it's also very, very costly. Powerful in the late game, but very useless in the early game. Then Advanced Despina, again powerful in the late game, very useless in the early game, has a 1 mana ability where you can pay any amount of extra mana and then search your opponent's deck for creatures with the combined level and cost equal to that number. So, for example, if you're trying to get Library Guards, which is 3 mana, 2 levels, and draws a card when you play it, you'd have to pay 6 mana, because it's 1 for the ability, and then 5 for the cost and levels to get your Library Guards. Very, very cost inefficient, but you get it for free, and you get to tutor for 1 out of your opponent's deck, which allows for a lot of metagaming. As I said earlier, very, very good late game, very, very bad early game. Lastly, we will go over Corruption. Now, Corruption at the moment is arguably my favorite color, along with Wisdom, mostly Corruption though. And when it comes to dealing with threats, they have the best creature removal in the game in my opinion, and the most incompetency against artifacts and spells. So they're usually paired with either Nature or Wisdom, which can deal with both. In terms of creature removal, they have some incredibly cheap removal that's incredibly powerful, things like Noxious Fumes, -2/-2 for 1 mana. Vermin, which can be used on your opponent's turn as a sacrifice effect, and Consume Spirit, which is usually a 2 for 1, because you kill something, buff something else, and then you get that lovely, lovely 2 for 1 just for 2 mana and some corruption levels. It also scales infinitely, basically. Besides that, they have lots of other finicky ways of dealing with creatures, things like Necromantic Cult, which you can kill things, get stronger, and then kill more things. But, as I said, when it comes down to dealing with artifacts and spells, you're stuck. So, onto their creatures. Now, their creatures are... they pretty much all have something that makes them interesting. There's a couple of exceptions. Now, they do have quite a few vanilla creatures. They've got Zombie Legionnaire, 1 mana 2/2, but 1 speed, massive drawback there. Zombie type, which is a little bit relevant, but not fantastically relevant. But they have the Zombie Legionnaire as a vanilla. They also have the the Bedeviled Fiend as a vanilla, 5/3 with 2 speed for 3 cost and 2 levels. But besides that, pretty much everything has some sort of fancy effect. In the case of Vermin, it's a removal. In the case of Remains, it has a drawback because it has high stats. And in some other cases, you've got things like Necromantic Cult, which I mentioned, is very, very complicated. Where whenever anything dies, you can pay 1 mana, put a Might Emblem on the Necromantic, and you can remove them to give -1/-1 for this turn. And if it dies, guess what? You can repeat the process over and over and over again. As a general thing with Corruption, most of their really powerful minions have some element of drawback on them. Things like Dread Knight has 1 speed, and this moving back to the back row means they can't block, but it also means you can't attack them. Things like the new card, this is the completely new one that replaced Bezorok, Zira, Ziara, I have no idea how you pronounce that, and anyway, Sovereign of Souls has an effect which is symmetrical, which means that it affects your board as well, which can be a big drawback at times, but most of the time it isn't, but it can be. So that's the general process when it comes to Corruption. They're all very, very slow. They generally have high stats or an impressive ability to make up for it, but when it comes to blocking, not so good. In terms of spells, they have a lot of removal. They also have a sub-theme of mill, where decay is milling, where you take things from their library or deck or whatever you want to call them and put them into the graveyard. So they've got things like Flash of Delirium. They've got things like, if I can scroll up, Dreadful Nightmares, which mills cards, Nightbringer, which also mills. They even have milled creatures. Infernal Vulture, you play it and then it mills cards immediately, and there's an element of graveyard manipulation in the case of Reanimate, where you can put a creature from your graveyard back onto the field. So when it comes to spells, they're pretty versatile when it comes to dealing with creatures. Again, creatures are their specialty. The last spell I want to talk about is Restless Tombs. Now, Restless Tombs is this persistent threat where it's basically a graveyard with reanimating zombies. And each turn you get to put a zombie on the board for absolute free. Now, because Corruption can't deal with spells in any way, mirror matches and Corruption usually come down to who draws more Restless Tombs because they just can't handle it. So, onto shrines. Corruption has two very good shrines as I get disconnected for inactivity, hoping that wouldn't happen, but I forgot to exit the collection screen. Haunted Cemetery brings back anything you kill for that turn as a zombie. 2-turn cooldown, which is not that long, and it only costs 1 mana. High resource requirement, but generally you want to double Corruption anyway for a multitude of other reasons. So quite powerful for utility land, at least compared to a lot of the other classes which have a fairly weak one. Dominion and Corruption have two pretty powerful lands. They usually both get used in a lot of decks that that both of those aspects are used in. Then they have Sanctum of the Void, arguably the single most powerful skill shrine in the entire game, where on a 3-turn cooldown you can pay 2 mana and the enemy hero has to sacrifice a creature. High resource requirement, very high resource requirement, but low mana requirement, reusable, and a source of card advantage. Very, very brutal. So let's have a look at their heroes and see how this relates to their decks. Basic Nephros. Now, Basic Nephros has Touch of Nausea, which allows you to reduce the speed of a creature until the end of turn. This is a very powerful effect because, as I mentioned, Corruption is very, very slow. In fact, it's one of the only ways they can attack 3-speed creatures is with a 2-speed creature and Touch of Nausea, and it means they can attack 2-speed creatures with zombies. Very, very powerful. There's a reason it has a 2-turn cooldown. Then you've got Advanced Nephoros, one of the more powerful heroes in the game, where at the expense of 3 mana, 2 life, and a hefty resource cost, you can return a creature that died this turn from the graveyard, not your graveyard, onto the field under your control. Now this, along with Sanctum of the Void or some of their other removal, means you can essentially kill their big, scary guy and then reanimate it, or use it to loop enter the battlefield triggers with the Dominion land I showed earlier, where you can sacrifice your own creature to draw a card and then just reanimate it, which means you basically just drew a card for no cost. Well, I mean, you still spent mana, you spent 4 mana, but the point is you just drew a card without putting any investment into it besides just mana, which is refills at the end, which refills every turn anyway, so it's fine. So that's my basic overview of all the aspects. This one was a bit shorter than the previous one because I actually figured out how to do this properly now. But I'm going to put this onto the list of videos that I'm going to link under every single Spellweaver video I do. Keep in mind, if you want to see my first impressions, I will put that in the description along with the first half of the aspect overviews. Now, my next Spellweaver video will probably be a deck tech of some kind, or it might be a trials overview and guide. I would like to see what you guys want to see first, so I'll record that probably in a day or two, and I'll just base which one I do based on what people want. So if you want a deck tech of some kind, I'll do a deck tech of a budget deck, or I'll do a overview of trials. So put that in the comment section and I will just follow what people want to see. But anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below and ask me anything. If you want to find me, I'm usually on TeamSpeak. The information is in the description. But as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.